just seems to me that if something occupies our airspace and we have the best pilots in the world, some of our Navy pilots on the so-called Tic Tac video, I was talking about the other day, and some young person said, "Oh, look at this boomer. It's a TikTok video." I said, "No, in fact, it's Tic Tac. They're shaped like the little candy. That's why it's called a Tic Tac." And I am a boomer, I guess, as my daughter has told me before. But I'm okay with that. But and I worry about something that occupies our airspace. And I'm wondering, I question why all the members of Congress are not concerned about that, especially when we have these trained pilots. I'm wondering, why should Americans care about the UAPs or UFOs?
Sure. Well, Congressman, you're absolutely right. I think certainly a lot of your colleagues whom I've spoken with share your concern. And I think those of us in the national security apparatus also agree it's important. And the question is why? Well, when you have some sort of, let's call it an airplane or an aircraft or a vehicle, having the ability to come unimpeded within controlled U.S. airspace, it's a problem. At a nation's capital, we have a no-fly zone. And if someone were to break that no-fly zone, the first thing we do is scramble a couple F-16s. And I think there's good reason for that. And so let me, if I may share with you and your audience, a very quick analogy. I think a lot of your constituents probably live in very nice areas, but I also suspect that a lot of your constituents, like I do, before you go to bed at night, you probably lock the front door. Of course, we don't expect anything bad to happen, but we just, out of, I think, an abundance of security, we go ahead and lock the front door. And some may even go the extra step of locking the windows, making sure they're locked and turning on the alarm before you go to bed. Let's say one morning you wake up to have a nice hot cup of coffee or tea, and you walk downstairs, and all of a sudden there are muddy boot prints in your living room that were not there the night before. Now, no one's been hurt, nothing's out of place, nothing's been taken, but despite you locking that front door and locking the windows the night before and turning on the alarm, there's now muddy boot prints in your living room that weren't there the night before. The question is that a threat? And the response is, well, could want it to be, so we should probably figure out what it is. And very much to the same degree in this topic, we have something that can fly unimpeded and to some degree undetected within our controlled U.S. airspace. We don't know what it is, we don't know how it works, we don't know where it's from, and we don't know what the intentions are. We can see some of the capabilities, but we have no idea the intentions. So therefore, one must assume or presume these things could be a potential threat if they wanted to be. So from a national security perspective, it's really our job to figure out, is it a threat? Now, it's a little bit more complex to when it comes to national security to figure out what is actually a threat, because that calculus is really two parts. You have capabilities versus intent. And as we just mentioned, we've seen some of the capabilities, the ability to maneuver in our skies in ways that, frankly, we can't replicate, high G forces, instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic. Of these things, and therefore we don't know if it's a threat, so we have to presume it could be. Furthermore, you have a substantiated track record of these things interfering with our key nuclear technologies and equities, whether it's nuclear power, nuclear propulsion, or nuclear weapon systems. I think some of your constituents might be surprised to learn that even at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, there's been some UAP sightings historically in and around that area. We're not talking about little green men from Mars. What we're talking about is something that for decades now has had the ability to fly in our airspace, and we don't know what it is. Let's just presume for a second, which is it's very unlikely, but let's just presume for a second this is some sort of adversarial technology. Let's presume it's Russian or Chinese tech. Well, that means then for the last several decades, these countries have managed to develop some sort of game-changing of our very best intelligence efforts. We completely were blindsided. And I think if this turned out to be some sort of Russian or Chinese technology, which we're pretty sure it's not, this would be the greatest intelligence failure our country has ever faced, eclipsing that of 9/11 by an order of magnitude. So I think you and your colleagues have every right to be concerned about what this is. We are now well beyond the conversation of whether or not it's real. The Department of Defense just testified that it is real, that it is a national security priority for our country, and we still don't know what it is. So I think you have absolute reason to be justified in your concern.
Well, one thing I was concerned about, and I was disappointed, we didn't have any of those military men that were in those airplanes testifying, and that the video they showed I thought was a joke. They had Adam Schiff, who I obviously don't agree with politically on anything. We're actually cordial, and we share the same interest in some recycling and composting things. But besides that, he said, "What exactly am I looking at?" And they could not stop the frame in a 30-second video. They couldn't. And so everybody was looking at the glare, and I thought, that can't be it. It's got to be something else. And I was so disgusted with the Tic Tac videos. And I understand some of them say that there might be a question of whether they've been cleared. But they've been on 60 Minutes, for goodness sake. You can Google it. And it just really disgusted me. I just shook my head the whole time. And it was literally a pilot inside of a canopy filming something with his cell phone as it flew by, or he flew by it. And, and there's so much more definitive stuff out there that people could have seen, and that could have focused more on the issue. And that, to me, but again, I think the reason they do this the way they do this, and whoever they are, but it's such it's so classified, and it's so contained that they're just talking within their scope of knowledge. If you remember, one of the questions that was asked, a Republican member who's a Marine captain, actually, and he asked about a specific incident, and the guy was saying, "I have no data about that." That's a intelligence cop out way to answer, but the reality is, these guys are so limited in their scope of knowledge, and that's my biggest fear. When they put some czar over this, it's going to be some astrophysicist or something who has very little knowledge of UFOs or UAPs, just what he hears, and he's going to come out with a report saying, in fact, this is something we don't understand, and then we'll move on to the next train wreck, in the news. And so I'm afraid that is the ultimate plan. But in saying that, though, I would love to hear some testimony from some of these pilots. And I don't know how you offer them immunity or what. But as I said now, they said, well, it's out there now. They're not, they're allowed to come forward. But the reality is, the reality, and I know the reality. There's a stigma attached to that. And the only reason we're talking about this is because of those dadgum Tic Tac videos that are out there that actually show the interaction of an American pilot saying, "What in the world is this?" And the video of it, the audio of the pilot, and the video of whatever these craft are, defying every rule of physics that we have. And so, and I've talked to several that have been involved in those situations or been in the air when others, and they're reputable people, but they are afraid to come forward. And I'm wondering, what do you think we could do to make it easier for them and for airlines? We've got a lot of airline folks that report it, and then you listen to the people back on the ground as they're reporting it, and they're already making fun of them. It's almost like a standard thing. "Oh, did you see the little green man? Oh, ET." And so they're just basically humiliated. And there's a documented case of one of our best fighter pilots. He reported something when he came back. There's guys on the deck, ET phone home and stuff, with signs, And so I wonder, do you think there's some way we could make it easier for our military troops to report these encounters?
Congressman, that's a very insightful question you're asking on what we can do. And I go back to your suggestion here about offering some sort of amnesty, where perhaps we can waive the non-disclosure agreements that a lot of our pilots, to include people like me, that are bound by, where we are not allowed to talk about our experiences or certain aspects of classified. Some could argue it's those non-disclosure agreements that are hindering us from further understanding what these things are. I think you're absolutely correct, and I think Congress is very wise to start looking at this from the perspective, okay, how do we allow people who may have been involved in legacy efforts involving the UAP topic to come out and finally talk to members of Congress and even talk to this new organization at the DoD level now, the AOIMSIG office. So that's a mouthful. In order to have this discussion, you know, one thing I was very disappointed in the hearings, and I think you're absolutely correct. Also, you know, there was moments where even the Department of Defense did not know its own information. I remember when I believe it was Congressman Gallagher who asked for the record, "Are you aware of the Maelstrom incidents here in Montana?" And they, after response, DoD finally said, "Well, we're only focused on official DoD reporting and investigations." What they don't realize is that it was official DoD reporting in an investigation. There's an actual DoD IIR intelligence information report that was subsequently released through the FOIA process about Maelstrom. That's the only reason why the world even knows about that incident of these UAPs interacting and interfering with our nuclear missiles, was because there was a DoD investigation and an official report that went out at the classified level and then wound its way up in the public sphere. And so it was those type of responses that were very frustrating to me, because it's clear that the Department of Defense really doesn't have a handle yet on the full scope of this. They don't even know where their own reporting lies. How are you possibly going to be able to inform Congress of what these things are if you haven't even done enough homework internally to see you have in if you will, in your own closet? So I think you're absolutely correct, and I think other members of Congress were equally frustrated. That's just one of many examples that I found very curious. And again, I think what can be done is perhaps this next year, if some sort of language could come out that absolves some of us and the over restrictions of security classification, so we can finally have an open conversation. So the pilots can come out, the special operators, the radar operators, those individuals who came up close and personal. People don't realize, Congressman, that this is happening every week. These incidents are occurring all the time, and the videos that were shown to during the hearings to the House were ridiculous. One of these had already been put out on the internet a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. I think what the American people want to see and what Congress expects is the new stuff, the high fidelity videos where we're seeing these things going from 200 knots to 300 miles an hour. Where we see it on camera, right? And we can see it interacting with our aircraft. That's what Congress expects. And that's really what Congress should have received this last hearing. I think the good news here is that if I was a betting person, which I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I suspect there'll probably be more hearings in the future.
With all this, do you think that these things are a threat to us? I stated on a British thing, I said we'd all be a bunch, if they wanted to get us, we'd all be a bunch of crisps by now, which is a potato chip. I mean, but in England, I was throwing a little local lingo out there to them, and they were impressed, as you could imagine, with my Southern accent saying that. But you know, do you think they are a threat? And my point was, you know, we've been dealing with these for decades or hundreds of years. Actually, I mean, if you go back to the Dark Ages, there's actually paintings and there's UFOs in the background, hieroglyphics. I mean, first chapter of Ezekiel, which I quote all the time. And so my point is, with their technology, if it's something from out of this world, I would think they would already have done us in if they wanted to. I just don't see it as I think we need to know, because it's in our airspace, and we need to rule out the fact that it's anybody else on this globe that has it. But and if it was, I've stated that they would control us, they would own us if they could control it and do it. So what do you think, Lue?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point, sir. From my perspective, I think the biggest threat is ignorance. That is the biggest threat. There's a distinct difference between a potential national security threat and hostile intent. What do I mean by that? When I go to the airport and I jump on a my way to Washington, D.C. or somewhere else, there's no real threat there. The aircraft isn't threatening me. And yet, if I were to go to that same aircraft, but jump out of the jetway and onto the tarmac and run behind the engine while the engine's on, then yeah, there's probably going to be some sort of threat to me. I'm probably going to get burned. I'm going to lose my hearing. There's biological consequences for that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that UAPs are a threat necessarily. The fact that we don't understand what they are, that for me is probably the biggest concern. And I think from a national security perspective, because we are responsible for understanding what is in our airspace. There's something called US Air Domain Awareness. We have flight safety issues. Certainly when I'm on a 737 or my family, I don't want there to be any chances of some sort of mid-air collision, obviously. So I think when we talk about threats, we're really talking about maybe air safety threat. So far, we haven't seen hostile intent. However, in this country, we have the example where our nuclear arsenal, particularly a flight of 10 nuclear missiles, were brought offline by a UAP. In Russia, the report is opposite. In fact, in Russia, it appears that a UAP actually turned them on. So that's kind of a scary notion. But whether or not it's a direct threat to us or humanity, no, I don't think there's any information to substantiate that right now. I think you're correct in that assessment. I think again, I would emphasize the greatest threat here is our ignorance, and it's our inability to face the reality that these things are here, whatever they are, and the inability to have the conversation amongst each other.
Do you think yes or no? Do you think we're being our federal government or military industrial complex, what have you? Do you think they're being transparent with the people about the UAPs or UFOs?
Probably as transparent as mud, unfortunately. The question is it deliberate or is it just ineptitude? Neither one is really a good option for me. Certainly the national security apparatus I came from was very efficient, very effective. So I find it hard to believe that all of a sudden now the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, has become completely ineffective in 4 years. So that tells me there's something else going on. I am very optimistic that as you and your colleagues continue to peel back the onion, you're gonna find some really interesting information here.
I hope so. I hope so, Lou. Thank you. I get asked a lot of times what I think, the phenomena is, and it's basically, and I say the same thing. It's not Russia. It's not China. We know that. I don't think so. Or they would, Putin's ego. I've said many times, if it's Putin, he'd land one on the White House lawn, get out, ride a unicorn over and wrestle Biden and get back in it and head back to Mother Russia. If China was, their quest for world conquest, they'd be conquesting. And that leaves really two things. Is it us? Do we have some technology? And if so, where did we get it? Is it reverse engineering? To me is a very likely thing. You wonder where they get the money for that, but we just sent $53 billion to Ukraine. And in my distrust of the federal government, I can't imagine all $53 billion getting over to where it, buying bullets in Ukraine. I just can't buy that. But I also, how many people would it take to have a skunk works project? And if it is like, and I've heard Lazar say that it's some kind of deal that they've in an archaeological dig and they're reverse engineering. I don't know. Is it Roswell, something? It really doesn't matter. The fact that I just don't see the problem in acknowledging what we have. I don't buy the whole thing. It's going to upset the religious network. And I'm a born again Christian. I believe it. I believe Jesus died on the cross for my sins. But I also believe when I walk out at night and look at the vastness of God's universe, that light from that star that I'm seeing left before the time of Christ on this earth. That's how vast God's universe is. And
yes, sir.
I can't get I sit out there at night. I can't imagine, and it's not heresy. Heck, it was heresy back when people said the earth was flat. And then, you know, they said it was, people came out with this idea that it was a globe, it was round. And they're like, what? That's heresy. That's awful. You know, you're going to go to hell. But the reality is it's just a vast universe. And I fear a government that fears its people. And I am part of the government, and I realize it. And, you know, and I'm going to face ridicule, as you do. As I was going to tell you the other day, I was reading something about you, and I said, I was going to call you and say, you know, when you're over the target, that's when they do the most shooting at you, brother.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, you know, I think you're absolutely right in questioning your government. It was once famously said that the most patriotic thing you can do is to question your government. And I was a product of that myself. I was also in the government for many, many years. I agree with you completely as far as putting any type of dominion over God and the grand architect of our universe. I think to put limitations on the creation, I think is very short-sighted. If there's one thing that we keep learning over and over again, is that God has a vote. And every time we think that we can veto that, we're usually taught a very valuable lesson in life. I think that there's a lot of reasons why people may not want to have the conversation. I agree with you. I don't think this is going to affect religion at all. I don't think there's any reason to. I think when, as you said, when Galileo first proposed that the Earth was round based upon the Copernican observations, that there were some people who were concerned. But at the end of the day, it didn't affect religion at all. In fact, I don't think it's going to affect government, religion, or any type of institutions. I think that is part of what, you know, God's gift to us is curiosity, and always trying to learn and figure things out. To me, I don't see any conflict between Christianity or Judaism or Islam or any other with this topic. I think it's really our own bias that we have to watch out for. But I don't see any conflict with the Bible at all in this conversation. I think what you're doing is, I mean, my personal belief is history is going to prove you right, and I don't think you're going to have to wait a whole long time to see that come to fruition. I will also tell you that there are a lot of people consider you a champion for this cause, because you are willing to have the uncomfortable conversation about a topic that has been sequestered for a very long time. You mentioned something saying, I don't think it's our potentially our secret technology, or Russian or Chinese. And I think if we look at this in the perspective of temporally, from a time perspective, you're absolutely right. We have government documentation that was very classified that's now been released to the public, going back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where we describe it today as a white flying tic tac, but in the 50s, they described it as a white flying throat launch, and the 60s as a white flying butane tank. Exactly the same thing, flying at 13,000 miles an hour, captured on radar, eyewitness testimony from pilots and law enforcement officers, trained observers, right? And if you look at that, where were we at the end of the 40s and early 50s? Well, we were just coming off the heels of World War II. We had just entered the jet engine era. We had barely broken the sound barrier and hadn't even been to space. And yet here are these things traveling at 13,000 miles an hour back then. Well, where was Russia? Russia was still moving ammunition with ox-drawn carts. And where was China? China was in the middle of a famine. So I think it's highly unlikely that this is some sort of foreign adversarial technology. And we've already said for the record in the hearing, by the way, under oath to you and your colleagues last week, that this isn't our technology. This is not a blue force technology, which means it's not our technology and it's not our friends and allies' technology. That was stated for the record last week.
Who do you think? Who would you like to see testify? Now, I'd like to see you up there, but because they're not going to trip you up, and you'll say what you want to say. But who would you like to see up there testify?
Well, I'd love to see my colleagues that were in ATIP. I'd love to see them testify. I'd love to see, there's an individual who was my deputy in ATIP, who then, I guess I can talk about it now because it's come out publicly the last couple of days. He was the first UAP task force commander, and he was my deputy. His name was Jay Stratton. I think it'd be great to have him testify. I think some of the PhDs and scientists we had in ATIP come out and testify who were part of efforts earlier on. I think it'd be great to have, if we could, perhaps some of the folks of the task force, and then ultimately some people that were involved in much older legacy efforts. So another interesting point during the hearing, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Moultrie, who was testifying, he admitted he knew about ATIP, about program, admitted about Project Blue Book. But there's 50 years gap in between the two. What about all the programs and efforts that existed in between that time frame? And the response was rather unsettling. Well, we're not looking at anything. We're not looking at anything that wasn't, considered official or formal. Well, some would have argued Blue Book wasn't official and formal, and ATIP wasn't official and formal. What's your definition of official and formal? If you have actual federal employees assigned to do a task and they're being paid money that Congress gives, I think that's pretty formal. I think that's pretty official. Right. So I would recommend anybody who is associated with that, those legacy efforts, to come up and testify under oath to Congress and finally allow the truth to be known. That'd be my suggestion.